Hello everyone, welcome to Everything is a Riot, where we reclaim the word riot as both an act of celebration and disruption. In this podcast series, we dissect the everyday structures of power through an anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and anti-racist lens, challenging the systems that bind us and reimagining what freedom looks like.
We'll explore how resistance is not only about confrontation, but also about joy, community, and the creative disruption of the status quo. Because in a world where power seeks to control, a riot, whether born of joy or defiance, becomes a vital act of reclamation.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to Everything is a Riot. I'm Mariya, the digital editor at the Contrapunto magazine, and in this episode, we're diving into the discussion around the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement, and its call for an academic boycott of Israeli educational institutions, complicit in what many describe as Scholasticide. Joining me today are two other voices from Contrapunto, Shangbie, the staff writer, and Haris, the editor of the publication. Together, we'll explore the intersection of education, oppression, and solidarity. What is Scholasticide? It's the deliberate destruction of educational systems, the targeting of scholars, and the erasure of knowledge. Israeli universities have been accused of scholasticide and complicity in the occupation. In this conversation, we'll unpack the academic boycott, examine the role of global solidarity, and ask, what does solidarity mean for resistance and justice? So just to set the tone of the conversation today, we're recording this podcast just a few days after the ceasefire in Gaza. And this conversation is in the light of the nearly 2 years of violence that we've seen unfold right before our eyes. One of the things about genocide in Gaza has been that it's the world's most documented atrocity, and the IDF leaves no stones unturned in visualizing the war crimes. And just thinking about that, one of the photos that comes to my mind is that of an IDF soldier somewhere in Gaza burning down books. And there's a library on fire right behind him, and he's burning some texts and is kneeling down, and it's kind of a very strong image of what many have called scholasticide, which is the complete disruption and annihilation of academic ecosystem in the region. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the scholasticide, but also the flip side of it, which is the boycott and divest movement against Israeli institutions that has taken up speed in North America and Europe in the last few months. It does come a few decades too late, but it's still surprising to see, to me personally, that the boycott movement faces so much pushback from academic institutions that pride themselves on being anti-colonial and anti-imperial and have massive diversity and inclusion departments. And yet we're seeing one of the biggest decolonization movements of our lifetimes unfold right before our eyes. And it's just very difficult to sit with the reality that it faces that much pushback from institutions that have prided themselves on studying decolonization movements that happened in the 70s and the 80s.
The thing is, right after the October 7th events, following the Gaza war, the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip, which was almost besieged for almost 18 years through land, air, and sea, there was a constant alarm over the complete annihilation of the, other than the social life, the political life, also the what you call the educational ecosystem. There were alarms over the scholaricide, being Scholasticide being...
it is still a word that is being introduced to our vocabulary specifically because the rate at which the disruption of academic life is taking place in Gaza has previously been so unseen that we've had to devise new words for it. So it's still taking time.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was this growing concern over the pattern of the violence that was taking place in Gaza, which included deliberate destruction of the Palestinian educational system, which included killing of teachers, arrest of students, obliteration of the buildings, universities, and so on and so forth. So, as you said, the Scholasticide and the discussion over the academic boycott has been increasingly growing. The narrative around the two has been constantly being running in parallel ever since the invasion of Gaza and the violence that has since unfolded. There has been a growing emphasis on how Palestinian educational system has been completely annihilated and why there is a need for the academic boycott of the Israeli institutions.
But I think that's precisely what is so surprising is that despite the very visual, very well documented, complete annihilation of academic life in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine, we're still not able, there's still, I don't know how, but there's still doubts over why we need to be boycotting Israel or not being able to separate Israel as an oppressive force from conversations on I cannot. I was going to say anti-Semitism. I cannot say that. Maybe Shangbie, you go.
No, I mean I think it's a very valid question, and it's very crippling to think about how, especially when we compare it to when we talk about boycotts of any form, whether it be material boycotts or academic boycotts in particular. I think it really draws us back to the boycotts of South Africa's apartheid state, beginning, I believe, in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And what the differences, I think, really lie in a sort of unity and really the shaping of discourse on the issue. Yeah. I mean, I think back in when South Africa was still doing apartheid, there was a UN, I believe, recommendation. It was a UN. No, it was more than a recommendation. I think it was a resolution in 1965 that urged academic institutions to sever their ties with the apartheid state of South Africa. Yeah. And the United States. Yeah. And a lot of the major Western powers. And at that time, the Western powers were very, very influential. They were on board with this. Yeah. And then over the course of 30 years, South Africa was completely paralyzed in terms of their academia. South African scholars couldn't participate in conferences, couldn't submit to journals, couldn't do exchanges, couldn't do anything. And in the span of 30 years, South Africa really succumbed to the pressure, and that was one of the, I would say, one of the biggest reasons why South Africa abolished apartheid. But we're not seeing this now, and for the longest time, ever since BDS has begun for Palestine, we've seen immense pushback from not only Israeli scholars, but other scholars from the United States, the UK, whatnot, from the West, which were in the past instrumental to dismantling South Africa. Yeah. And I know perhaps anti-Semitism is a sensitive word, but this is one of the reasons that people cite why they disagree with the academic boycott, because it's anti-Semitic, and I think we all firmly disagree with that.
But that is very interesting because you draw a parallel to back to South Africa, and of course there's stark differences in how it's being handled now. But what is even more surprising is that we don't even have to look as far back as 30 years. But when Russia invaded Ukraine very recently in 2019, we had massive pushback from all institutions in Europe toward Russia, citing very clearly in all their circulation material that it was Russia that was the aggressor, and that we had to sever ties with Russian institutes, and that there had to be a complete disruption of any kind of normalcy with institutions and institutes in Russia, whether they be aligned with the state or not. And it was just hilarious to see that just a few months, a year down the line, there is a complete loss of memory of the actions that were taken, just a few months ago. It is even when I know this personally, that a lot of student groups have pushed back on European universities, talking about the Russian boycott by European and North American universities, and that similar suit not being followed for Israeli institutions, and no concrete answers have been given in this regard.
I mean, then the terms scholasticide sort of is usually used interchangeably with epistemicide, which sort of alludes to the fact that the ongoing plausible genocide of the Palestinians is being sort of negated by the aggressor and those who supported the governments of the UK, US, and the other Western powers, and it precisely illustrates that erasure, that while we are obliterating your physical existence, we are also obliterating your educational system, and also not acknowledging it, and using different discourses and narratives, which includes the definition of what anti-Semitism mean, has been used to sort of erase the realities of the Palestinian, including the scholasticide happening. So it's quite in an ironic way, or not so ironic way, that what you're seeing is part of the process of erasing the violence against Palestinians, whether it's on their lives as well as on their cultural markers, such as its educational institutions.
Yeah, definitely. And I was just, before I came here for the podcast, I was reading a bit about what some have said about these academic boycotts against Israel. And I want to sort of shine the light on this Forbes article from 2019, and it's just
can't wait.
Like, I'm just gonna do a little bit of summarization for you guys, because it's sort of saying the same thing, but the article is titled "Why an Academic Boycott of Israel is Hypocritical." And the reason why I want to bring this up is because you just now brought up sort of the hypocrisy of the discourse around who to boycott, when to boycott, and why. And this article, albeit 5 years old, I think it's still very relevant, because it's the same sort of talking points that we're seeing today that are against any sort of the BDS movement. And essentially, the main gist is they're calling the BDS or academic boycotts hypocritical, because apparently this movement holds Israel on a higher moral standard than any other country.
That is,
in the sense that if you're boycotting exchanges to Israel, or Israelis coming to anywhere to do exchanges at your university, you should also do the exact same with other countries that have human rights violations. And this article cites again and again China and the problem and the issues in Tibet, Southeast Asian countries, like Myanmar, for example. So essentially, it's sort of taking this. I don't even know how to describe it, because I think it's just a really problematic article.
I think it really speaks again, like the problem speaks from within academia again, is that the words like settler colonialism or colonialism are so ill-defined, and there's so little actual tangible effort at concretizing these words, because obviously these institutes have ties with certain power structures that restrict them from actually defining these words well, that now this Forbes article can cite China vis-a-vis Tibet as a settler colony, and then and then not be able to criticize Israel for doing the same in Gaza or the West Bank.
Just sorry to cut you. Just to add to what Shangbie was saying, I was reading through a very recent journal article from a peer-reviewed journal talking about the experiences of the Israeli academics in wake of the Gaza war, and it wanted to understand how the war in Gaza has impacted the lives of Israeli academics. And some of the things that the results it showed was that there was an overt discrimination of the Israeli academics. They were facing challenges in international collaborations, and they talked about ethical and professional dilemmas doing their work, long-term impact on their careers, and so on and so forth. But what was hilarious in that article, that there was hardly any reference of the Palestinian students, academics, or even Palestine itself.
Yeah.
So it just goes back to the point of like this whole discussion centers around the question of erasure.
Yeah.
Erasure not just of the lives of the Palestinian, but also the erasure over the knowledge production that happens over them. While there is a persistent violence that seeks to sort of erase Palestinian, blueprint on the lands where they are inhabiting, there is also a constant erasure of the discourses around the Palestinian lives and the violence that takes place on the Palestinian body. And precisely if there is an academic boycott of institutions that are complicit in doing that, it doesn't serve the systems, right? It doesn't serve the power that is sort of participant to the violence on Palestinian, and that's what makes the BDS or the academic boycott becomes a very critical tool to sort of challenge what is happening.
100%. And just like speaking to what Shangbie just said, talking about the Forbes article saying that Israel is held to an unrealistic standard, whereas other countries, quote unquote, are not. I would say, I think in contemporary times, I don't think there has been another group that has been subjected to having to normalize coexistence with their oppressors more than the Palestinians. You have entire student bodies, executive boards of universities that are riddled with ex-IDF serving soldiers, and these are people that are welcome in conversations about Israel-Palestine solutions or peace in the Middle East or whatnot, but there's complete erasure of any perspectives from the Palestinians, be it students, be it professors, be it PhD holders, be it doctorates, be it postgraduates. It's actually fucking insane.
Yeah, I mean, it is insane, and I think we can all speak to that, right? But I think what's happening now is that we're seeing like the hands of like the people who work at universities and institutions, their hands are so incredibly tied.
Yeah.
And I mean those who do want to make a difference, those who are speaking out for Palestinians, and those who are not in favor of the Zionist entity, but their hands are so incredibly tied because it's come to a point now where the settler colonial project, the project, and also Zionism has been so ingrained into all sectors of society, and especially in European societies that we know, to the point where there's absolutely no chance, I would say, of like big institutions, academic institutions, making any sort of change. I mean, I think right now it's quite improbable to see it replicating what has happened to South Africa.
But exactly. But I think this opens us up to the conversation of what it means for these departments, especially for post-colonial studies and decolonial studies departments, and what it should look like for these departments to get any funding, any recognition going on from this point onwards, because these departments built themselves on the back of decolonization movements that took place in 1940s and 50s right up to the 80s, and that's where they drew their legitimacy from. That's where that's where a lot of scholars and subaltern studies and critical race studies and stuff gained their legitimacy and gained a voice on how to operationalize oppression and how to view colonization. But it seemed like in the past 2 years, these departments had completely forgotten what a colonizing power looks like. And to me, it's like I think this should become the marker for what future these departments should have. Quite honestly,
I mean, you're right what you said, and unfortunately, the discourse that is used to sort of silence any dissent, which seeks to raise these points. One is that there is some form of asymmetry in between the two powers, between the two fighting powers, the Gazan people and the Israeli.
They assume that there is symmetrical distribution of power.
Parity between the two, which is completely wrong. I mean, anybody who understands the conflict, it knows there's the asymmetry of powers. That's brought to the often brought to the front of the discussion. The other way is that we know very little about what is happening. We don't have the precise facts. It's dismissed as an emotive issue, and of course the question around targeting of the Israeli individuals or institutions as anti-Semitic. But the discourses around Scholasticide and academic boycott is not in silos. It's not something that is coming from one sector, one particular group of people that is seeking to sort of boycott another set of people. I think there has been, and right from the beginning, a very systematic documentation of what was happening to the Palestinian institutions, students, activists, to cultural markers, cultural institutions, sites of heritage, archives. Everything was being put under destruction, and just within few months of the Gaza war, hundreds of students were killed, dozens of very senior academics were targeted, assassinated by the Israeli IDF. The case of, for example, the Palestinian poet Rafat. Yeah, exactly. And this was very well voiced by international bodies like United Nations rapporteurs on freedom of speech, on education, on Palestinian territories, and others. So, as I keep saying, it's part of this erasure of the Palestinian reality and part of denying the destruction and the violence against the Palestinian people.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I was looking at an article I wrote for a think tank, which I shall not name, but this was like almost exactly a year ago. It was beginning of January 2024, and I mean, of course, writing this article took some research, but it was an article on the destruction of academia and intelligentsia in Gaza, with the bombings of the universities, and which were justified by the IDF as a site of terrorist activity, so on and so forth, the usual. But I mean, it's a destruction of the current academics in Gaza, but it's what it is more, I would believe, it's systemic destruction of the future of Gaza, because what are the kids? Who are the kids looking up to?
Yeah,
right
exactly.
Before it was Rafat.
Yeah,
it was the professors.
Yeah,
it was poets, academics. Who are they going to look up to now?
Yeah.
Where do they get the knowledge from? There's boycotts. Sorry, there's cutoffs. There's embargoes. Everything. But what I do want to relate back to what Haris has just said also is that this destruction and this erasure of Palestine and Palestine academia, Palestine thinking, Palestine thought is not only on Palestine itself. It's one piece of the broader whitewashing of any sort of critical discussion about self-determination, decolonization.
Yeah.
It hits very close to home to us here, and we will definitely not use any examples, but we do know how very senior academics have been punished for not talking anything about Palestine, but just presenting a sort of nuanced perspective, for example, on Islam.
Yeah.
About maybe Islam is not what you think it is in the West.
Yeah.
And boom, what happened next, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to sort of supplement what Shangbie was saying, that those critiques who question the applicability of BDS or academic boycott of Israeli institutions, some of the arguments they have been making is that educational institutions are spaces of critical thinking, free speech, and it undermines if any boycott or sanctions is imposed on these such spaces, it undermines the academic integrity and free exchange of ideas and so on and so forth. But what precisely has been happening, when there is a discussion around Palestine, there is not just like complete clamp down on the students or academics partaking in these events or discussions. There has been, these spaces have been turned into police, sort of police actions have been implemented, surveillance, and people have been targeted, students, academics who have shown any form of discussion, who have undertaken any sort of discussion on the question of Palestine and the Gaza war. So it's quite, again, as I say, ironic, the kind of arguments that have been brought against the question of academic boycott. They end up doing exactly what they sort of are arguing for.
Yeah, it is a ridiculous argument, because if you were citing freedom of speech, or freedom of expression as a retaliation or pushback to the BDS, and at the same time you were witnessing a real-time killing, targeted killing, not just denying, not just erasure, but actual complete annihilation of academics, there's not even a question of a freedom of speech amongst the scholarly life in Gaza anymore, because there are no scholars left, there are no universities left. So even if the West now brings their so-called liberal values of freedom of speech and democracy to Gaza, who are they bringing it to? Because they have formally annihilated any future of academia in Gaza, and pardon my French, but fuck them. And they want to turn around and they want to say that we cannot boycott Israel because it's going to impede on the freedom of speech of Israeli institutions is a little bit ridiculous. How can you compare a dead body that has nothing to say to an oppressor whose voice is further clamping down on an already dead academic ecosystem?
But absolutely, and especially given that this war has consumed more to the lives of the children, the which perhaps form a huge cohort of students or future students.
They do. They have erased complete cohorts of young students
exactly.
in Gaza.
Of course, and there has been a complete destruction of any infrastructure, which includes both educational institutions and other cultural sites such as archives or libraries, public libraries. But fortunately, there has been a growing and increasing call, and this call is now not reduced to simply from other academic institutions or other elements of educational life that are calling for these boycotts, but it's coming from, let's say, a bit more latent groups such as the students' unions, the academic collectives and public in general. And I think perhaps these may not be the vocal voices that receive much of the mainstream media, but I suppose there has been now a consistent and a growing momentum towards it. And
Definitely, because I heard somebody say, and it really resonated with me, and I think the 7th or 8th month of the genocide in Gaza, when things were at its limit, and a lot of people were saying that like, we're going to be protesting, we're going to be boycotting, we're going to free Palestine. And somebody said that we're not freeing Palestine, that Palestine is freeing us, meaning that Palestine is becoming the vantage point for how we view justice, and it's teaching us how to critically have a critical eye on already critical, so-called self-acclaimed critical departments, which brings me again back to my point of how, like, Palestine has now become the near death of decolonial studies to a lot of people, because it's been ripped up and opened up as a complete sham for anybody that's looking, because if you're coming 20 years, 30 years too late to a genocide or to a decolonization movement, I don't think you deserve to be called a decolonial department or a post-colonial studies department or the subaltern studies department.
I mean, that's the hypocritical part, that Palestinians themselves can be the site of research for the white academics and based in Europe or global north universities, but they themselves cannot have the voice to talk about their suffering, their predicaments.
Yeah.
And they can be a site for all post-colonial scholars, of scholars working on settler colonialism. It makes a juicy case, unfortunately, and it's used as a tool to build careers of big scholars. But when it comes to tangible action, both within the institutions and in the larger collective movement, there is a hypocritical silence, and there is these arguments which I said have been brought forth to sort of erase any form of dissent, seeking a discussion on Palestine on the end of the apartheid moment.
But you also mentioned something that I would like to talk about, is that you mentioned white scholars making careers out of using Palestinians as subjects for their theses and their dissertations, and using it as almost like a social mobility in the quote-unquote social justice woke leftist world. But I would like to just shed some light on the fact that a lot of these decolonial departments and post-colonial studies departments are in fact led by people of color, are in fact led by people coming from the global south, who have stood just as complicit as their white counterparts in the departments. And we've seen it day in and day out. And it also exposes their own hypocrisy on many other topics. And their silence does not only speak to Palestine, obviously. Their silence also speaks to their own position in that they refuse to acknowledge as oppressors within their own context. But it also speaks to their lack of either to their lack of having an actual critical lens, or their lack of seeing themselves as subjects of change, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's despite all of this, I feel like there is I would like to remain optimistic about the academic boycott and the BDS movement in general, but I just want to bring up that the fact that there has. I think we haven't felt so constricted in our civil society space so much as after the 7th of October. I mean, the rise of the far right in a lot of countries, and the Netherlands especially, I feel like has a direct... Oops, am I supposed to talk about it?
No, you can definitely talk about it.
You make such a face, Haris. But I really hope this isn't like a plateauing of demonstrations and manifestations for Palestine.
Yeah.
Because in the past few months, I think, if I'm not wrong, there has been sort of a decrease in numbers, right?
Yeah.
And I know, like, you can't kill ideas. Ideas will always be there.
Yeah.
But the movements really have to keep going.
But you can instill fear, and
fear has been instilled. Why has the far right come up, right?
Yeah, it's not. It also, like, I think with the BDS movement kind of picking up speed in a lot of European countries, we were exposed to a lot of unfreedoms, if I may, that we were already subjected to, but we were not aware of because we just never felt the need to demonstrate, because we live under this dream of, like, quasi-socialist states, quasi-welfare states or whatever, that have, like, almost, like, quashed any, avenues of dissent. But with the extreme violence in Gaza, when people took on the streets, I think we were suddenly exposed to all the different kinds of oppression we're actually subjected to in the daily life that we just don't recognize, which also further then shows a very bright light into the slow descent of Europe into, like, complete fascism. Like, we're coming a full circle. And
but I resonate the optimism of Shangbie, saying that I think what is unfolding is just the beginning of a bigger, larger and wider movement for the rights for the Palestinian people, and not just for the Palestinian, and for the people elsewhere who are facing similar, if not equal, predicaments, the kind of violence they face, the suppression. I think there is a greater consciousness at least among the, let's say, critical masses, that no longer want to be, complicit in what has been happening, not just in the Palestinian lands, occupied Palestinian, but also elsewhere. And perhaps this is the inflection point where we might see a change in the attitude, both not just within the academic circles, but also within other silos, whether it be journalistic media, or other unions, farmers unions or workers unions, where there has to be a greater mobilization towards rights and upholdment of the law and justice.
I think with this optimism in our hearts, we come to the end of our first episode. I think we can all agree that Palestine indeed has freed us all, and that it has exposed us to the interconnectedness of oppression all around the world, and it has showed us our own place and our own complicity and our own helplessness in the system that we're subjected to. But it has also shown us how there is strength in numbers, and that if the masses are driven, that we do have power in numbers. And hopefully with this light in our heart, we hope for a successful ceasefire in Gaza.